So today's presentation is going to be speaking to you about my working group, which is the Central Australian Waste Management Working Group. The challenges that we are facing, why we're changing our waste management practices, what changes are being made, the new issues that we're generating from the changes that we're making, and why we continue to separate, and how we plan to continue and move forward with the current practices. So the working group was formed in 2012 and it makes up members including 3 remote councils, Barkly, Central Desert and Macdonald Regional Council, and government agencies including the Department of Environmental Health, the Northern Territory EPA, the Department of Housing Community Development, WorkSafe and the Local Government Association of the Northern Territory. So the group works together with planning how waste management best practice is going to be achieved and moving forward with these practices. This is a map of our territory, of Central Australia and the area that we cover. So each of those communities there have a council building made up of approximately 80% Indigenous members or community members who are members of staff. As you can see, it covers an area that's roughly or over 2/3 of the Northern Territory, which is approximately 1 million square kilometres. So when you're only talking about 33 remote communities, a majority of that being dirt road and pretty poor dirt road as well as, you can imagine just before we start there's many challenges. So of those 33 remote communities, populations range from approximately 100 people to upwards of our larger communities around 800 people. There is roughly the same 30 to 40 outstations, which is like a little community with 2, 3, 4 houses, which also require waste management or little pits or little landfill sites. So what we're trying to achieve through our practices is environmental sustainability, which is what we consider to be maximising resource recovery to minimise the amount of waste that we put into land. We all know that as waste management. We're trying to meet our obligations to our occupants of these communities and providing them that clean community, and also we've got our statutory requirements that we need to meet. So every year Council sits down and provides a budget for our waste management activities, which include providing bins to households, public places and businesses and government buildings. Our job is to empty these bins, effectively dispose of the waste that we collect in these bins, and of course manage the landfill sites. So we have many other jobs that we perform that aren't included in the money provided for this budget, and that includes picking up after community events. The Northern Territory is huge with their sport, and if there seems to be a football carnival or some other type of carnival, softball carnival, every couple of months in those 33 remote communities. So you could imagine the amount of activity that's generated and the amount of waste and litter that's generated on top of these small communities. So these communities go from 800 or 80 people to 800 people. They magnify threefold. So the facilities there just struggle to cope with that, and it's Council's responsibility because there's no one else there to do it, to fix up the problems. So we've also got a lot of legacy and illegal dumping sites around the place. As you can imagine, with the remoteness of these communities and the poor conditions of the roads, the vehicles that are purchased don't last very long. So what we find is it's a really big commodity for the community members to have a vehicle, so they must always have one. They're buying vehicles that are worth, well, they're paying $5,000 for a vehicle that's worth much less than that, so it's not in great shape and generally they don't last very long. So our stockpiles of abandoned vehicles continues to grow, which I'll go into a little bit further. We also lead community cleanup events. We maximise resource recovery as best we can moving forward, and we also provide a lot of community education programs. So the challenges, which are many that we face throughout each of these remote council areas, is that the rates received by these councils covers approximately 2% of what it costs for council to run our practices in the communities, which leaves a staggering amount of about 98% of funding that needs to be found every year from government grants, etc., for us to be able to just perform that basic function of councils. We have limited waste infrastructure, and the cost to get our product to market is massive, as you could imagine. Keeping staff in these remote areas is very challenging. That's not only people that move in from interstate to work in these remote areas, but that's also the local council Indigenous staff, whose turnover of position continues to be challenging for councils. So getting any continuity through employment is just very difficult. And as I've said before, the vast distances and the conditions of the road just make anything challenging. Each landfill site, for some reason, has been placed in an area of the least place you would put it in a community, which is generally right near a water source or a river, which is 98% of the time dry, but 2% of the year it's got that water flowing through it. So we wouldn't, whatever decision was made in the past to where we put our landfill sites, obviously the environmental aspect wasn't taken into consideration. A few councils can afford to relocate these landfills, so we have to do best practice, best we can do with what we have, by protecting that environment, protecting that water source. As you could imagine, in a desert location in Central Australia, the resource of water is very important. And in some places we have ample of it, and some places we have none, which makes it even more important to protect that water source. And of course, even with the redesign of new landfill sites, it's always challenging to find an appropriate site for a landfill area, and being able to get the landowner's consent to move forward and build a new landfill site there. So that's very challenging. So we've spoken about all the challenges that we face, and we all face those in waste management. So why do we need change? Because in the end of the day, we all know that the issues generated from waste management or poor waste management practices results in disease, contaminated land, water, etc., vermin, which results in unhealthy communities, unhealthy townships, and poor health overall. So why change? Because when we achieve waste management best practice, which is the best waste management practice that we can achieve with what we have, and a constant improvement, and you put that together with other environmental and health improvements, the results are tidy towns, healthy people, and more importantly, bridging the gap with Indigenous life expectancy. So how are we making the changes? We're upgrading procedures and then training staff in those procedures, updating facilities, and we're creating recycling facilities and opportunities as well. So these are a number of guidelines, operation manuals and plans that have been developed over the last 4 years, and we, more importantly, tell staff where these are available so they have access to them, but we also attend each of these communities on a regular basis and sit down and go through the training with the community staff. And what's more important, it's not just training staff, but because these people have got family and friends and wives and whatever in these communities, it's also really important that training is passed on to their family members, because the waste and the issues that are generated from the community members. We're upgrading facilities, so this basic landfill design can be adjusted to the shape of any landfill site throughout Central Australia, and that's what we work from. So we try and have a continuity at each landfill site, and the design will be the same, just albeit a little bit different in shape. So we are installing public drop-off bays. This has got a number of benefits to the community. One is that the community is being trained through the signage of these bays to understand the difference between what is general waste and what is a recyclable product. The signage educates them as well as, but also these council staff numbers are roughly 4 team members. And to get 4 full-time team members, we normally need to employ at least double that, 7 to 8 people that work on a part-time basis. So to get that 4 full-time staff equivalent to turn up every day is really challenging. So to get the community on board with the education and to assist in the waste separation is a really big important step. So we're limiting public access to contractors by generating a council compound which is gated and fenced and locked and supervised by the staff member, which is a general waste practice which has not been achieved, is still challenging, but we're almost there. And we're creating clean stockpiles of recycled material from those separation bays, which is improving that material, and hopefully someone's going to want to come and grab it, or we're going to be able to sell it to a market. The top picture there that you can see is there's not many of those left. There's a trench design, very shallow trench design, where waste is basically dumped in the top of there and waste is burnt to minimise the volume, and that's how we sort it. Doesn't matter whether it's metal, recyclable, general waste. That's the practice that is being replaced, and that is certainly the practice that was there 5 years ago throughout the Northern Territory. And that diagram below now is from our operations procedure manual. It's a standardised design with stepped, bunded walls, ramped exit, entrance and exit, and an ample amount of cover material stockpiled on site. So just that basic design and implementation in each landfill site throughout the Northern Territory, Central Australia, is having huge implications in getting waste underground and covered. We have a standardised signage design that goes in each of our 33 landfill sites, which is colour-coded, pictured, and also a difference between the drop-off bay and the stockpile site. So those larger pictorial coloured worded signs there are designed to help the public understand what goes into each of the separation piles, and those little street signs go into our council compound just to assist our council staff to identify the reds. The signage of waste in red goes into land and covered, and the yellow stuff is recyclable stuff that we hopefully can get a commodity for. So this design is non-negotiable. It goes into all 33 communities. As I've said, there's lots of sporting carnivals, so the population of the communities are travelling more and more these years off their communities. So when they go to another community, and if they use the landfill site, it's really important for them to understand that what's happening up the road is happening in their own community, and that just helps to get them on board. So over the past 5 years, you can see a massive difference. So where one looks like a legacy dump site, which was a standardised landfill design, and behind that waste set was probably a very shallow trench that's probably still smouldering from fire, and it's waiting for council to take plant down there and push it all in to that trench and to relight it to minimise the volume. The other landfill site is a community that is just finished upgrading their facility. It's not a new facility, it's just an upgrade. And as you can see, that's a drop-off bay, the public drop-off bay at the front there with nice bins, nothing's going on the ground. Staff don't need to get into the product, don't need to get dirty. They just use the plant machinery and go tip it where it needs to be. The compound behind there is so well organised that the stockpiles are clean, and it's a pleasure to work. The first thing I asked the staff when we finished that work is, how do you feel about the last site compared to the new one? And they just smiled. It turns in from an absolute mess to a site that's a real pleasure to work at. That community and that landfill site also got a commendation at the recent National Keep Australia Beautiful Awards, and they were very close to winning the national award for the tidiest town in Australia, and that's a huge effort from a little community of approximately 400 people in the centre of Australia. They are literally the centre of Australia. And it must be said that 40 years ago, that community was, I suppose, the numbers in the community were from the train employees and the local Indigenous community were living in the mounds of dirt around the community. So 40 years ago, when the workforce moved out of the community, the Indigenous population moved into the houses. 40 years ago, in 40 years' time, it's not a lot of time, this community has gone from living in sand to almost winning Australia's tidiest town, which is just a huge effort. So, we're separating our waste, we're cleaning up our designs, we have just got much healthier environments with our landfills, so it creates more issues. The next issues. And these issues are, we've got approximately 480 tonnes of metal sitting in our landfill sites. And more importantly, we've got, these figures were taken in April of last year as well so this stuff grows all the time, particularly the vehicles. So in April of last year, there was 5,500 vehicles stockpiled around, sitting just outside hopefully sitting outside the landfill site. Sometimes they were sitting in. So I would imagine that those numbers now would be well over the 6,000 vehicles. So currently, the markets that are available to us are scrap and metal, particularly with the prices going up. So we've got markets in both Adelaide and Darwin. We have container deposit and a business in Alice Springs, which takes our bottles and cans. We have also a tyre recycler in Alice Springs, and we've got access to e-waste recycling through Alice Springs Town Council currently. So the issues with getting our recyclable material off community, remembering the vast distances to start with, starts with industry requires council to complete all the work and wear all the cost. So when you're trying to seek 98% of your funding each year, that's just impossible. Trying to get freight companies on board as well as, because of the costs, they need to make money. And also majority of the vehicles and the transport that goes out to communities are transporting a food item. So to try and get these guys on board, even with Keep Australia Beautiful supporting us as well as, it's just near impossible. Industry don't have the ability to service the Northern Territory or our remote communities. They can service right up the middle on the bitumen, which equates for about 5 to 7 communities of the 33. So the remaining communities have no access to getting their materials off community in the foreseeable future. So lots of challenges for our areas. So why do we continue to separate and stockpile our material? Because our waste volumes are only ever going to continue to increase. Metal is worth a lot of money at the moment. Metal prices are up, and councils could see an income from this metal to start with that they can then use to remove metals and stockpiles and vehicles from communities, but they can also use this money to remove cardboard, plastics, tyres, etc. So we need to see that as seeing that as a commodity. And there's a cost that the councils never really understand or never think about at budget time, that there is a cost of approximately $200 per cubic metre to bury waste in the ground. So there's a cost anyway, so minimising it is saving us money. Industry cost to service our communities is high, but it's only going to continue to get dearer. And it's poor environmental management not to do so. So the game plan to move forward to keep improving our systems is we're going to work to combine our volumes. So we're going to use the volumes of all 33 remote communities, which takes a nothing volume to an impressive volume, but we've just got to be able to get it together. And we plan to do that by creating centralised depots, which are based around the bitumen, and nominated those areas. I won't go through them because you're probably not aware of where they are, but basically they run straight through and they're accessible. And we're going to use our current transport methods to move our material, which means a council truck going out or an employee coming in, they've all got utes or they've all got trucks, so the material can come back and forwards. So we can just use our current practices. We need to see our materials as a commodity, example the metal prices, and we need to use that income to help us to get that and transport our material to market. And we need to seek funding for baling equipment and transport equipment from the government, which is a normal practice for what we do. Moving forward and keeping moving forward on the great work that we achieve, we just need much better buy-in from the communities. We need assistance from the government, as I've mentioned many times. We need to improve our practices, which means we need to understand our volumes, we need to understand our waste management costs, and we need to amend our charges so that our budgets relate to what it costs us to manage those landfill sites. Thanks, guys.